Hello, friend, and welcome to this episode of SpeechGoods, where you are going to get a very, very not just special treat, but like more original treat than the normal treats that you normally get on this podcast. Because let's be real, they're all treats. Okay, so the person that is going to be on the interview today is not an SLP, but he's actually a financial planner who is married to an SLP. So let's tell you a little bit about Craig. So Craig Goldslager, he has his MBA and a CExP. I'm probably messing that up. You know, I'm so used to saying MACCSLP, so you'll have to give your girl some grace. So Craig is married to a speech language pathologist, literally. As a husband of a practicing SLP, Craig, he understands and knows the practice and business landscape of speech pathology, and he understands that it's changed significantly in the recent past. The financial implications of being an SLP has changed as well. We know this. So why have I even started this show, right? In 2019, he founded Utterly Financial to help SLP private practice owners become better educated, prepared, and organized for the financial implications of being a business owner. Honestly, I felt like in this episode, Craig was like the peanut butter to my jelly, if that makes sense. I always say in any courses I sell, the ebook that I have, I am not a financial planner. I am not. But the really cool thing is Craig actually is. We get into some really nitty-gritty topics. I encourage you, if you are not watching this on video, try and find it on video on YouTube so that you can see some of the visuals that Craig actually shares with us. He talks about retirement. He even shares a story about how he's able to use private practices as part of someone's retirement plan and selling your SLP private practice. That's something that a lot of us don't really even think about in private practice. So such a really amazing interview. He drops so many knowledge nuggets because this is his job every stinking day. So be sure to listen to the whole thing and be sure to check out all of Craig's information if you yourself are a private practice owner and you're looking for some financial guidance. He is absolutely amazing. All right, let's go do the dang thing and get to the conversation with Craig. Hello, Craig. How are you doing today?
Hey, Danny, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, I am so stoked to have you on the podcast today. Now everybody listening, I'm even hoping that Craig's going to show some visuals with us. So if you're watching this on audio, you may want to go check it out on video. I'm just saying. But Craig is actually you are a financial advisor, but you are a very special financial advisor, and that you specialize in working with SLPs and SLPs in private practice. And I kind of always say, like on Instagram and on the podcast, that as much of a finance nerd as I am not a financial advisor. So how do we remedy this? We have Craig come on the show and chat with us. So Craig, can you tell us a little bit about like what you do and how you got to this sort of like niche area, helping out us amazing speech pathologists?
Yes, I certainly can. And just before I get into that answer, I just want to share a general disclaimer. And I do just want to state that whatever I share with Danny today, please take as general informational purposes only and don't construe it as tax, legal, or specific investing advice for your specific situation. So with that being said, as Danny mentioned, I have started over the last 3 years now, really focusing my business and my practice on working with speech language pathologists and private practice owners. And so prior to that, I worked with business owners across a wide array of arenas and professions. But I would say the catalyst for the change was one, I married to an SLP. Hi, Lauren, if you listen to this episode. And so what really the genesis was not just being married to one, and it started by speaking at universities, her local university, where Lauren actually got her master's degree in speech and earned her C's. So it started with that, but then the real breakthrough was occurring at an industry conference I spoke at about almost 4 years ago now, and it was two private practice owners. And this is an array of private practice owners, from sole proprietors who just broke away from, let's say, their school district and started their own business, to clinicians who had multi-locations, multidisciplinary, upwards of 50 to 100 employees and contractors. And so what I spoke at that conference was something, the name of the presentation was called Leaving Your Business is Inevitable. And so I spoke, and I had given a similar speech at other industries and other conferences because, Danny, you as a private practice owner, me as a business owner, there is a 100% certainty we will leave our businesses someday. And so you have to plan for what's called succession planning, the next chapter of your business. And even if there is no next chapter, how will you sell and perhaps monetize your business? Because I know we'll get into talking about retirement planning and saving for specific goals, but I would argue that being a business owner is such a tremendous advantage because you have a special bucket in which you can save into, which is your business. Many private practice owners don't necessarily think of their business as an investment or a way to monetize and perhaps save for retirement. But back to the presentation about leaving your business is inevitable, I fast forward because at the end of the presentation, I met a clinician. She came up to speak with me for about 5 to 10 minutes after the conference, and she shared her story, which I'd like to share just very briefly because it's really the Simon Sinek why. What is my why, and why am I working with SLPs and private practice owners? And so she came up to me after the conference and she said to me, Craig, I just want to share my story with you. I lived at the time in Southern California, Los Angeles, around the Los Angeles area. She was a private clinician. She had maybe 4 or 5 independent contractors that worked with her, and her husband had received a promotion to move to Northern California. And so, what did she do as the general, good hearted, wonderful SLP she was? She referred out her entire caseload to other clinicians in the area, in the county, and she closed her doors, stopped paying the lease on her clinic, and moved to San Francisco and restarted. So, after hearing this speech about leaving your business is inevitable and learning that you can monetize and eventually sell your private practice, she asked me to value her business for her. And so by sending me the financial statements required as a private practice owner, we believe there are 4 critical key documents: your balance sheet, your income statement, like your profit and loss, your statement of cash flows, and of course your tax return. So she sent us a bunch of the documents, we reviewed it, and we had valued her business to be worth approximately $650,000. So again, being the good-hearted, natured individual that she was, she referred that out. And I don't know about you, Danni, but I sure would like an extra $650,000 towards my retirement or towards anything else I want to accomplish financially. So that was the light bulb moment where at the end of the conference, I wasn't there to solicit, get new business or anything. It was just there to educate and share about succession planning and monetizing your business. And so I asked the 100 attendees to fill out a survey if you had any interest in hearing from me and my team to learn more about what we do, which I'll get to next. And so 50 people turned in the survey. And so I was like, wow, there's certainly perhaps a need or something here. And so fast forward 3 years later, we now work with clinicians in 16 states, dozens of private practice owners, again, ranging from sole proprietors who are just breaking away to clinicians who have multi-location, multidisciplinary, hundreds of employees, and have businesses valued well into the 7 figures.
So what exactly do you help these private practices do? Like, I know you do retirement planning, but like, can you give us some examples of what people are coming to you for?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so if to bring it all back to a step, because sometimes I work with individuals as well. You might be an SLP who works in a hospital system or a school district. You don't have to be a private practice owner, but it all comes back to helping think about what money does in your life for you. And so we're big believers that money can help accomplish what you desire in life. So maybe that's buying a new house. Maybe it's saving for children's college. Maybe it's reaching the goal of retirement and defining what retirement means for you. We believe the foundation for planning, financial planning, to be just goals and having set goals and to accomplish goals. And so what I've done lately in some presentations that I give, and this could be a fun exercise to do with you right now, Danni, because you've never done it before. So there was an industry study in my industry. There was released in the Financial Planning Association Journal in 2015 an article talking about cognitive biases that exist with people without having knowledge or lists or education or information to make informed decisions. And so you may not want to share it with your listeners. You might, I'm not sure. But the point of the exercise was, if I were to ask you what your 3 financial goals are, what would you state those to be?
You want me to answer?
You can, or you don't have to, but we could.
Well, I would say like time freedom. So passive income streams. So I'm not trading time for money.
Right.
I would say the ability to be monetarily generous without significantly sacrificing my lifestyle.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's a money goal, but like a business model that allows me to teach and mentor others. But I don't know if that's a finance goal.
No, so those are three great broad-based goals. And so the point of the survey or the point of the research study was that. So people would list those goals like you just did. And those are three wonderful goals that you want to accomplish by working with your private practice. So we talked about doing this in the pre-roll before we hit record. I'm going to slide over one of my slides now, and I will share with you, and this is what I do during the presentation. And so what I'm going to share is a master list of goals. And this is the first thing that we do with clients, and we go over a goal list. So let me just share my screen with you. And what you'll see is a list of all different goals based on overarching objectives that you want to accomplish. So we break it down into general categories, some of which you talked about, right? Self-development and professional goals. So how do I reach financial independence, and how do I set up my business structure to give me certain goals that I want to accomplish? Others are retirement goals. Maybe you have family goals. We haven't talked about children, but that's an important goal for a lot of families.
Yeah.
And then you can see here, it's a lot of yes, no questions, right? So just off the top of your head, you went over 3 goals and you shared those with me, and thank you for sharing them with me. But you'll see on this list, there's about 70 or 80 questions. And we don't necessarily go over all of these, but these are really valuable questions to ask yourself. What do you want to accomplish with money? And as a financial advisor, I can't answer that question for you. But what I can do is, based on what you say yes to, and if you feel that you're ill prepared or haven't even started saving for specific goals, we make sure that you do it as efficiently and as appropriately as possible by looking at your current cash flow and your spending, and then making sure that you're doing it efficiently. So the common goal of retirement, are you saving in the most advantageous account possible for you based on your financial situation? Like if you're employed with a hospital system, are you putting it into the 403B or the 457 plan? If you're self-employed, are you saving into an IRA, a Roth IRA, your own 401k? So at its whole, we focus on product or specifics last. It's more important for us to have a plan first. What do you want to accomplish? Like this master list of goals. And I'm happy to share this with you, Danni, after the recording, so you can share this with your listeners. But not only the list of goals, right? Then we go through our process and we evaluate what you currently have and where you want to get to, and setting those goals. Because when we talk about retirement, I know this is an important topic for most people, and most people want to. It's our tagline on our website. We help SLPs save for retirement, because most people know what retirement is and want to reach that goal. But what's important about retirement is that it means different things to different people. We like to rephrase retirement as making work optional. Because, for instance, I have a client who's 38 years old, and she and her husband are talking about reducing workload and making work optional because they've accumulated assets in various accounts, and they're able to supplement their income from work with income earned from these various accounts. And income could mean rental income, it could mean investment income, it could mean royalties, it could mean putting courses together, right? There's so many different ways to earn income, especially in 2022, that the whole goal is thinking about what you need to live, a monthly income amount, and how can you reproduce that if you work or if you are unable to work.
And I love what you're saying. And this is something that I feel like I've talked about a lot. And every time I have like a one-on-one session with someone, it's always, I think people, and especially as SLPs, where a lot of us are very type A, and a lot of us get so focused on the how, which the how is important, because obviously like that's how you're going to get to where you want to go. But you're not going to know the how until you know the where, right? Until you know what your specific goals are. And then this idea of like taking those goals, because even the goals that I gave you, like, yes, I want to have passive income so that I have time and I have flexibility with my time. Okay, so like that's broad. And this idea of breaking it down and getting even more specific. Okay, how can you get that passive income? Is it going to be through rental property? Is it going to be through some sort of like standing online business? Is it going to be through a private practice? So I really love this. I love this.
Right. And so it's the famous WH questions of being an SLP, and you're going through all of them. And it's not just, right. It's not just what are you doing to accomplish it, but how much do you, I know that's not a WH, but it's the 6th one, right? Mm-hmm. How much do you need? So you can quantify, do you need 5,000 a month, 15,000 a month? You might experience this with some of the people you talk with, Danny, but I'm sometimes just shocked that people just money comes in their checking account every month and it goes out every month and they don't know how much they're spending or what they're spending on. So just sometimes if you're a listener and you feel that way, sometimes just reconciling and going over the credit card statement or the debit card account and seeing how much you're paying for things, dining out, car payments, random things,
Mhm.
it won't course correct right away. But just like when you onboard a new client and you are going through your assessments and you figure out your plan of care, it's the same thing financially. You can't know the finish line if you don't know, take an assessment of your current status. So when we talk about cash flow and earnings and the income that you earn from your job or from your business, yes, there's something left over at the end of every month, but sometimes it's looking at the expenses and maybe you are spending on things that are no longer important to you, or maybe they're important, but one of my favorite sayings is that you can save for anything you want in life, but you can't save for everything.
Yeah.
And that's right. And that's one of the biggest challenges we see is the prioritization of some of these goals that we talked about earlier with people.
Mhm.
And so everyone wants to save for retirement. Everyone wants to buy a house or buy a new car or save for children's education. But sometimes there aren't enough dollars to save appropriately for retirement and your child's education.
Mhm.
And so, how do you value that? And what do you determine to be the amount you should be saving for children's education versus your own retirement versus paying off a mortgage and just the specific goal, right? So, you can insert any different goal, but everyone's priority list is different. So, the point of this exercise, the master list of goals and naming those three, after this research study presents this master list or a similar master list of goals to the recipients, 30% of people change at least one of their top goals, 60% of people change at least the top two of their goals, and 75% of people changed all three of their top goals. So the point is that sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And while you might be saving for a specific type of goal or a certain objective, along the way, there might be things that change in life because again, the client who I'm mentioning earlier, she's 38, preparing to retire. We had this whole I'm another fan of saying planning, the planning ing process, not just a plan. Because historically, what my industry would do is it would give people a 100-page binder of here's the projections, here's the green line, here's what everything will do, and here's how your next 30 years of your life will map out, right? So this client 4 years ago was a single individual living in California. She now married someone and she is now a stepmother living in a different state, and everything changed in 4 years. So
Mhm.
if you stick to the original plan, it doesn't mean planning and thinking about things in the future are not important. But the as we all learned for the last 2 years, right? Things change in life and they can change very quickly. And so having flexibility and the ability to remain fluid as things happen to us are really important.
And I really like how you said plan, and I think that's something that's very anxiety provoking for a lot of SLPs. Because I mean, and everybody out there, yes, I'm talking about the SLP stereotype, but I'm just saying it's a stereotype for a reason. Don't get mad at me, everyone. But I feel like there's a lot of anxiety around like, okay, if I make this perfect plan, and then what if it changes? What if it changes? And I always equate that to when you're in the therapy room, a lot of times you can come in and I remember this thing from grad school. You'll come in with the perfect activity and the perfect plan, and you'll walk in the room and the kid is just not about it. Like not about it. And you just have to, and I think the word during all this pandemic stuff has been pivoting. And I think it's so interesting to me how SLPs as therapists, like we have to be flexible. We have to create a plan and have those big goals in mind, but also be flexible with how you get there, depending on how the child's going to react. And it's really interesting to me how we're so good at doing that within our job, but when applying that sort of thinking when it comes to our finances is really hard for a lot of us. And I'd really like you to address, Craig, the emotional piece of money, because I know that so like I have my budget without burden course, right? Teaches SLPs like how to go through their finances and budgeting their money according to what brings them joy. Go buy the avocado toast if it brings you joy. You do your thing, boo. And there's a lot of discussion about like the shame and the emotional piece around money. And I've had multiple people reach out to me and just say, like before they took the course, it was they knew that they had to look at their, their credit card statements and see how much they were spending. But there was an emotional side that was so difficult for them. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. And I'm so happy we're addressing it. There's a really good book I would recommend to your listeners called The Psychology of Money, written by Morgan Housel. Have you read it?
That book. Yes, it's on
It's
my
so good.
recommendation.
And I'm fortunate enough I've heard Morgan speak at a few of my industry conferences, and he's so good with writing. He writes, I think it's weekly blog at the Collaborative Fund, and his articles are just so good. Some of them are long form, some are short. Just a brilliant writer. And he wrote a whole book addressing exactly what you're talking about. And so I think just before we get to the specifics on the money side of and how the emotion relates to the money, you can equate it to a lot of other goals that people want to accomplish in life. And sometimes people know what they need to do, but for some underlying things, and I'm certainly not a therapist and I would never proclaim to be, but let's just pick another common one, right? Eating healthy and perhaps keep maintaining weight or losing weight. Most people know you need to exercise, eat less calories than you consume, and you'll either stay the same weight or lose weight. But oftentimes there's reasons why people eat fast food, or they eat unhealthy, or they eat things that they know are bad for them and it's not in moderation, and for whatever reason. So there could be certain reasons. And I think sometimes people just, whether it's poor money habits that are not even instilled in them in childhood, or they don't, I know the other thing, most common thing I hear from SLPs is you didn't learn any of this in school, you didn't learn any of it in graduate school, and it was just not, you didn't take a personal finance 101 course. And so unbeknownst to all of you, you sign up for a credit card and you start spending, and you don't realize that you don't pay off the balance in full, and all of a sudden you're whacked with a 20% interest charge on the credit card. And so all of a sudden one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden now you have 5 figures of debt and you're paying huge interest rates, and it could be student loan debt, automobile, mortgages, all sorts of different things. And so the first thing I would say is sometimes you just don't have the background and you don't have the information. And so that's step one. And so having resources like you, Danni, are so wonderful. And there's so many important things to learn along the way that I know many of your listeners probably haven't learned at some point. Secondly, I think it's just a thing with today's world of social media and fanfare and FOMO of spending, and people just, like I said, you can't save for everything, but that doesn't mean that you can't go on vacations. If traveling the world brings you joy, you should have a travel budget and save for the financial goal of traveling. If driving a certain type of car brings you joy, then you should allocate dollars for that. But if I meet therapist 1 and therapist 2, I can't just tell someone save money for a new car or save money for your children's college, right? Some people are very debt averse, and we can get perhaps into the specifics of mortgages and good debt or bad debt or things like that. But I think what the emotional thing really comes down to is just, 1, the lack of knowledge and information that goes into the decision making, and 2, it's hard conversations. It's difficult. If it was easy, everyone would have infinite wealth in their bank account. But I'll be honest, I'm a financial advisor. I don't necessarily enjoy saving money. I'd rather spend it. I'd rather spend it on my kids or go traveling with them, go to Disney World. We live in Florida. I would go to Disney World with them all the time to see the smiles on their face and how much joy it brings them, right? But when you have this plan, or when you're planning for things in life, that's when we see. And so it all comes back to the question, some of these other questions. And so there's a lot of parallels between speech pathology and personal finance, just like those WH questions we're talking about. When does someone want to retire, right? A common question is, well, how much do I need to save for retirement?
Yes, I get that all the time.
Well, I would love to know how you answer it, because it's different to everyone. Yeah. I mean, there's general rules of thumb, right? Someone might say you need to save 15% of your income in order to achieve a goal. Okay, great. Well, do you want to retire in 40 years? Because if you're saving at 15%, you'll be able to retire in 40 years. And then all of a sudden, a 25-year-old's thinking about 65 and then say, yo, you know what? I want to retire when I'm 50. Okay, great. Well, you won't be able to do that on 15% savings. You're going to have to save probably closer to 25 or maybe almost 30% of your income. And then you might think, well, yeah, I can do that, but there has to be some sacrifice made. The only other sacrifice, you can increase your savings 2 ways, right? You can either earn more money or cut your expenses. And cutting expenses helps to a point, but you got to eat. You got to have a roof over your head. Most
Mhm.
people need a car. There's fixed expenses in life that you have to pay for. So the second way is to earn more money. And
Mhm.
that's working overtime, starting your own business, side hustles, online businesses. I know, Danny, you talk about a lot of this stuff. And so those are the real ways, but it all starts back to what I was talking about earlier, the philosophical and emotional goals of what you want to accomplish. So that's just a general question. Sometimes people, I'm so happy you shared that with me, that people will say, well, how much do I need to save? And I say, well, when do you want to retire? It's not even retirement. When do you
Mhm.
want to fund a down payment for a new
Mhm.
house?
Yeah.
When do you, right? Whatever, insert financial goal here. We have
Mhm.
a formula, and there's a basic formula to save for any financial goal,
Mhm.
right? So let's just pick a goal. Let's just say it's a down payment for a house. And there's four variables that you need to solve for when you're trying to solve for any financial goal. You need to know how much you're willing to save. We'll just do it in terms of monthly. So let's just say I can save $100 a month. What can you earn on that money with interest or rate of return by either investing it or helping your money start working for you? So we can talk more about investments later, but just in this example, let's say I can earn 3% on my money. Great. How long are you willing to save is the third variable. So am I willing to save for a year, 5 years, 50 years? And the fourth one is how much money do you actually need to accomplish the goal? So as long as you know three of those variables, bring you all back to algebra, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are shuddering because I know many SLPs do not love math, let alone algebra. But if you know those three, you can solve for the fourth, right? And that helps set a lot of the expectations that we were talking about. Because if you want to save $100,000 for 1 year and you're only willing to put aside $100 a month, there's a problem because there is no investment in the world that will produce a large enough rate of return to get you that $100,000. Sometimes the opposite's true, where someone maybe wants to save $100,000 and they say, great, I'll save for 40 years and I'll put $10,000 a month away. Well, if you put $10,000 a month away, you'll have $100,000 in 10 months,
Right.
right? So when I just throw out numbers and random dollar amounts, it might just sound like marshmallows in people's ears. It might not mean anything, but that's how you have to connect the emotional side and what you want to accomplish financially with your goals. Because, like I've said, I have some clients that spend $5,000 a month and live a very happy life. There's other clients that I have that spend $30,000 a month to live. It's all different. It's all proportionate, but at the same time, I can't tell you what brings you happiness financially or what goals you want to accomplish. That's the real psychology of money and figuring out what you want money to do for you. Sometimes people really value time. And I think you mentioned that earlier, Danny, right? Like one of your three goals would be to have more freedom or have more time to accomplish other things you want in life. And if that's true, money can help buy you time back, right?
Mhm.
I would argue that a lot of us delegate a lot of tasks in our day to day, whether we realize it or not. Like, do you grow your own food?
A little bit, but like
Do you really?
not most of it. I have a garden, but
Oh,
most of it I
that's
don't.
cool. Wow. Well, we can go into that more because that sounds very interesting. But the reason why I say that, and because most people say no, you're one of the few
Right.
that have actually said, yes, I have a garden. But um, everyone goes to the grocery store or the market or shops. I mean, 100 years ago, the average person would have grown her own food, made her own bread, churned her own butter, but that takes so much time. But now you can go to the grocery store once a week, spend an hour or two. You could even get Instacart delivered to your doorstep now to save even more time. And yes, there are fees, and maybe it's a little bit more quote expensive to do it that way. Maybe it's cheaper to grow it on your own, but you just bought back multiple hours in your week because you're not farming and you're not growing your own vegetables or you're not doing all that on your own, right? So when you delegate things and you delegate tasks, and this is a really important thing for your private practice owner listeners, I would argue that's the biggest challenge that we see for sole proprietors starting out and getting into the business, trying to start with the delegation of tasks. Because you think that when you start your private practice, yes, they're coming for you, but the only way to truly grow, and you might not want to grow if you're a sole proprietor. I know many clinicians and many clients that are clinicians who are sole proprietors, and they're very happy in the status that they're at now. But if you aspire to grow and build a 6, 7 figure business, it's, I would argue, nearly impossible as a solopreneur, just
Mhm.
because you have a limited number of caseload you can see, how
Yeah.
many assessments you can do, how many evals you can do, right? Your time is limited. So if you want to scale up and grow the business, that's when you have to start hiring your contractors, your employees, allowing others to grow your business with you.
And I like how you, and this is something that I say a lot, and you really, it was kind of like drizzled throughout everything that you were saying. It's not right or wrong. And I feel like there's, with that emotional side, I think people think, especially I'll give the private practice example. I like to share a lot about my private practice because I don't want a clinic. I don't want to grow my private practice to have a bunch of therapists and be in and out. That is not something that would bring me joy. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's just not my thing. For me personally, I use the flexibility that private practice allows me that I would not get if I was working for someone else to grow other income streams versus building the private practice into something big. And that's not a right or a wrong thing. It's just about what are your goals. But like if I was your client or if I was talking to myself, I could say, okay, Danni, you don't want to grow this business and make it into a 7-figure business. That's fine. But if you have these early retirement goals, how else are you going to increase your income? Like, I've increased my income significantly by starting my own private practice, but there's a cap on that. Just like you said, like, I can only see so many kids. I only want to see so many kids. Like, I don't want to see, that's the reason why, part of why I started my practice in the first place, is like, I was tired of working until 6 and 6:30 at night every day. And so looking at it like, all right, that's not, that's going to be a great income stream for you. But if you are wanting to build some serious wealth, what are some other things that you can look at, especially now that you have this time flexibility? Like, my husband and I, within the next 2 years, the goal is to get our first rental property and build a rental portfolio. I'm doing this online business. Like, those are the things that we have chosen, both individually and as a married couple, to increase our income and increase our income streams. And I think people have a hard time, like, when I talk to people about private practice, I think they all think that they have to build a clinic. And it's like, you don't, if you want to, like, girl,
you probably, depending on how many other private practice owners you speak with, just what I've heard anecdotally and seen empirically. I was at ASHA in Washington, D.C. back in November, met a lot of private practice owners. How many successfully pivoted during the pandemic to teletherapy only and told me, Craig, you have no idea how much money we've saved because we got rid of our brick and mortar. We just don't need it anymore. Mm-hmm. Most of our clientele is perfectly capable and happy to do teletherapy. And some of those things, when we talk about cutting expenses, that's one of the common things you can do in the beginning, either in your personal budget or your practice's budget. Mm-hmm. And that only helps to a point, though. And that's what you're talking about with all these extra ancillary income streams and revenues. And so one of the major advantages of being a business owner is that I would encourage all the private practice owner listeners, yourself included, Danni, to consider your business an asset that you own. And eventually, just like I shared the story in the beginning of the private practice owner who gave away an asset worth $650,000, every business owner has to leave her business someday. And there's no reason to just do that, refer everyone out, and not try and monetize it. Mm-hmm. It might be 5 figures. It might be 6 figures, $100,000, $200,000. But as I said before, that would certainly help you accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish of getting a rental property or other types of financial goals you want to accomplish, additional income streams. So I know another common thing, depending on your specialty, we have a lot of clients who work in the fees world, right? So they talk to me, do I want to buy scopes? How much should I spend on a scope? Do I pay cash for it? Should I take a line of credit? Should I do anything like that? And that was just the conversation about debt earlier, and that not all debt is bad debt. I would argue all credit card debt is bad debt because you shouldn't be paying 20 to 30% interest to anyone. But other times, if it's an investment in the business, right, you have to invest in your business to see some of those amplified returns and growth. Meaning, if I can buy a scope, which would enable me to charge double what I'm charging now for a specific type of fees or a specific type of evaluation, you calculate what's called the payback period. And all of a sudden, if I do X amount of procedures and I charge Y dollars for it, I have to do Z amount of procedures to get my payback or pay off the scope. And so the question of cash versus credit is sometimes people are so scared they consider debt to be a 4-letter word, like the other bad 4-letter words. And that's just not always the case, because if you're willing to invest in yourself, I mean, I would argue most people have debt in their lives already. Most people don't pay cash for their house. Most people don't pay cash for cars. And in today's low interest rate environment, sometimes it's possible to get really favorable financing rates, especially if you're a business owner and you're starting a new business, whether it's through the SBA, your local credit union, larger financial institutions. Just the key comes down to sometimes people don't want to pay $20,000 cash for a scope, or they might not have it. But should that get in the way of you buying that scope? Or should it get in the way of you buying that device or doing a marketing activity or any investment into your business? The goal is to measure it and make sure that it's going to produce a positive rate of return, or ROI, the return on the investment. But that's another common thing that we see, because everyone starts out, everyone gets going, but then to figure out how to either buy back some time efficiency. So maybe it's investing in EMR software, right? Or a certain type of EMR, or hiring assistants. You don't have to answer the phone to your clinic. You might hire someone to do that task for you. Yes, it'll cost you money, but it'll free you up either time to see clinic, to see kids or adults, depending on your setting, or it'll give you time back.
I think a lot of it is just thinking through these decisions. So like even going back to what you said about the debt thing, like for fees, I think though, like you're never going to be disappointed when you gain more knowledge to make a decision. And I think like a great example. So I have my Budget Without Burden course. I did my first launch with it a few months back. And then I'm going to be launching it again, probably in March. And so making the course was a lot of work. Like it wasn't a huge money investment. It was mostly a big time investment, because like I'm making videos and making materials. And one thing that I did to validate before I put in all this work and put in a time investment to create this course, I wanted to validate the idea. So how did I validate the idea? I used the platforms available to me. I went on my Instagram, asking people what they wanted to know and validating the idea. And first of all, you're never going to get 100% validation, by the way. Like, it's not like, nothing's 100% guaranteed, but just at least like before I kind of put in all that time and all that effort, validating the course idea. I even pre-launched my course. So I actually sold the course before I had even fully created the entire thing, to make sure that there was a need and a demand for the course. Because I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of, is like they put in all this time and effort or money into something and that it's going to flop. And that there's ways to do it responsibly. There's ways to validate your idea. There's ways to, kind of like you said, like for your fees thing, like if you're thinking about buying a fees machine, well, you need to make sure that there's a market for fees in your area. Like there's research that you can do, and just equipping yourself with some knowledge. Again, nothing's guaranteed, but a lot of times that gives you a really good framework and a really good idea of where you're going to be, or where you're going to be going, especially from a financial side, because at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. Like you can feel all the feels about how your business is doing, but at the end of the day, like you have to have like that monetary piece, and not that money's everything, but it tells you if you're running a business or not, or if you have a hobby.
Right, 100%. And I would also say, yeah, that's the other thing, right? Most clinicians, the common traits and why it's so nice to work with so many clinicians, they're all very good-hearted people, very nice, very friendly, very caring, just wonderful traits. But that doesn't mean that you always have to do that it's not to be the opposite and being a nasty person in the business world. But what you're saying is so important, to actually quantify and measure and see the results, right? And track things and measure. Really important. And then the other thing, just going on that for any other creators out there, people who are trying to do online courses or other things, is it means a lot less to everyone else than it does to you. And sometimes we think everyone else's opinion is such a huge piece of what's going on. But I promise that if you had a social media post that got no comments or no follows or no retweets or anything, I promise no one cares. It's a big deal in our own heads, and there's a lot of head trash in the world for everything, whether it's business related, personally related, right? But you say this, there's a really good follow. Do you know a guy named Jack Butcher?
No.
He has his tag names are called Visualize Value, and they're just really nice, quick little drawings with a quote attached. And as you were talking, I thought about his today. And today's it was, if you want to make the wrong decision, ask everyone. right? And it has a nice little visual that goes along with that. But it just a parallel to what you're saying is that you can ask 50 people before you do anything. Should you do that? Especially financially. Should I invest in this? Should I buy that? Should I do this? Well, you can ask 50 people, but it all comes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you listen to those 50 opinions, 10 people will tell you one thing, another 10 will tell you another. You're more confused than where you even began. And
Mm-hmm.
so the too many cooks in the kitchen is a very common thing. And so, depending on the business that you build and the practice you build, I always think it's good to go to resources of people who have done it before, those who can show you, improve, and have the validation, like you're talking about, Danny, with the numbers and the success. There's a lot of people who like to talk and say and espouse, oh, I've done this, or I do this, or this is how you get another 10 clients or another 20 fees clients a month by following this. Well, maybe that's true, but I'd rather go to the clinician in my county or on the other side of the state and sit, who's got this blossoming business, and ask her for a cup of coffee, or ask her and say, how have you built this? Because I do think that one of the main things that I have seen, there's a tremendous gap between experienced clinicians and younger clinicians. The gap that exists is that I find that there are many more experienced clinicians who don't have an exit strategy or an exit plan, like what I talked about earlier, the clinician who referred out all her business and wasn't able to sell it. That's the most common person or clinician that I speak to. Someone who is, let's just say, 30 years experience, in her 60s or 70s, calls me and says, Craig, I need to sell my business tomorrow. I want to retire. It comes back to everything we said about goal setting financially. You're setting yourself up for failure if you're just going to think that one day you're going to wake up and retire because I'm 65 and I have a certain amount of money in my bank account, so now I can retire. Or I don't want to work anymore, so I'm just going to sell my business tomorrow. Like anything, any goal to reach, even weight loss, right? If I go back to the fitness example, if you wanted to lose weight, you can't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to lose 15 pounds tomorrow. I mean, you can, but I don't know how successful that would be,
Mm-hmm.
right? It takes diligence and planning and giving yourself the time and all of that. So I think a lot of clinicians are, it's very well received when younger clinicians, and I don't know your audience. I don't know if they're younger, older, more experienced, less experienced, but it's a two-way street where sometimes it's the younger clinicians who want to be business owners, but are afraid to take that first step. And we can talk about many resources that exist to help start private practices and begin. But I would tell you that there's tremendous value when you're able to learn from a clinician who has 20 to 30 years experience, has all the referral networks within insurance companies, knows all the local pediatricians in town, knows all the school districts. There's tremendous value in all of that. And so it doesn't mean that you don't need to learn how to be a business owner also, but at the same time, they need younger clinicians to buy their businesses because that's just what succession planning is. And so I would encourage a lot of your listeners to think about reaching out to clinicians in their town, in their county. Maybe you want to develop a specialty like fees or swallowing, or work in a school district, or take over a daycare, right? In my local community, I'll bring up my wife as an example. She works with kiddos in that population, and she would love to work with the daycares around here. But there's all these experienced clinicians who have the ins with the daycares, right? So how can she strategize and think about, well, maybe I should build relationships so that way when these clinicians do retire someday, I'm the next SLP up, and maybe I'll get that school-based contract or that daycare contract.
I love what you said about that. There was one, it was a podcast. It was a podcast episode of Jenna's podcast, independent clinician. She's awesome.
Shout out Jenna. What's up?
Yes, I love me some Jenna. She's great. It's on her Private Practice Success Stories podcast, and that's actually the podcast I binged whenever I was thinking about starting my practice. And there was one woman who she interviewed. I don't know her name, but she was like a solo. She just did her own thing. She didn't build into like a clinic or anything. But she was saying, she talked about, instead of getting referrals, it was about like getting friendships and making connections with people, and how like a lot of times those, and I'm so glad you brought that up, a lot of times those things, they may not give you a return right away, but you're never, especially when you're kind of establishing yourself in the community, you're never going to regret building those relationships with different professionals. Or honestly, even like one thing she was saying, get in with like the secretaries and the front desk people at doctors' offices.
The gatekeepers.
Yes, they're the gatekeepers. And okay, I'm hopping around a little bit, but I find this fascinating. So you mentioned selling the practice, and I spoke at a conference like a couple months ago. I think it was a Black Private Practice SLPs conference, and there was a speaker who spoke on that, on using your private practice as essentially a big part of your retirement planning because you can sell it. That is so not in the SLP culture. It never occurred to me that I could buy someone else's practice. That is just not something that we ever hear about.
Well, this was remember, back to my story. That was this epiphany for myself. And when I spoke to the 100 private practice owners to that conference and 50 filled out the survey, I've never had a 50% response rate on anything. Most people don't, right? You do an Instagram poll and you get like 5 votes. You're like, sweet, 5 votes, whatever. But it's like, I was like, okay, there's something here. And so just to go a little deeper on that, there's 3 questions, and why I'm so happy you're reinforcing the importance of relationships is when you talk about exit planning or planning to sell any business, let alone a private practice, there's 3 key questions, which I would argue are 70 to 80% of the work. The first is, who is going to buy my business? And if there is no counterparty, you can't sell your business. Just think about your home as an example. You want to sell your house. If there's no buyer, if your house is run down, if the roof needs repair, if there's cracks in the foundation, nobody wants to buy your house. So you can't sell it unless there's a buyer for it. So that's why building these relationships and giving it time, just like your garden example, I use that one too, right? You plant your seeds and you grow your vegetables or you grow your flowers. It takes time. It doesn't happen right away. But building those relationships, and I promise all of your listeners, there are so many experienced clinicians who would be willing to sell their businesses in a period of time. It doesn't mean they're going to. Some call me and they say they want to sell ASAP. Others say, you know what? It's just like the emotions that you were talking about. I meet some of these clinicians. Let's say they're 55 years old, and they've been working for 20. Some of you might be experiencing burnout if you're a younger listener and you think, oh, I've been doing this for 3 or 4 years. Imagine doing it for 24 or 25 years, right? It's a challenge. I know how difficult your field is, and I know that their burnout is a major topic and a major thing that all clinicians experience. So they want to sell, they want to get out tomorrow. But if you can tactfully put together a plan where, you know what, we'll transition this thing over 3 years, over 5 years, just put that end goal in mind, and then you'll get there. It gives clarity and peace of mind to everything for both the buyer and the seller, right? Because it won't happen overnight. But just like these financial plans we're talking about, well, when do you want to retire? Well, that's where we figure it out. Is 10 years your goal? 20 years your goal? You need to know the income and certain variables like we talked about earlier, but the who is so important when you sell. The second is the when. Sometimes clinicians think that I need to get out today, but usually when there's a plan in place, they're willing to wait 3, 5. The longest one we have currently right now is a 12-year buyout plan between a brand new 1-year earned receives SLP and an experienced clinician. The main reason why it's so long is just because of the cash flow. Like eventually there does need to be the monetization and sale of the business, but they've entered into a legally binding agreement for the practice to be purchased over a 12-year period. So again, she hasn't sold her business today and the other clinician hasn't bought it yet, but by 2031, it'll be sold.
And so it's like, that does not happen, but it happens in other businesses. Like, and I want to I'm curious on your opinions on that. Cause like my husband, he's an HVAC technician. Okay. So they do heating and air. Their company just bought another company and it's like a 1-year process. The previous owner is actually still working in the company, but is now like technically an employee and getting a salary. And like just little things like the vans and stuff, they still have all the old company's names on the vans because it's basically like a 1-month period. And anyways, I just find it fascinating that there's so many things you see in other industries that are totally applicable to ours, but we just don't have it in our industry for some reason.
100%. And that's one of my missions to help change that, because it's a lot of the sales that we've been a part of from sometimes the clinician who hires us is the clinician selling the business. Other times it's the clinician who wants to buy and just needs help and guidance through the buying process. But what you're saying is so true. Another common question that we get is, is it ethical for me to sell my practice? Because
Mm.
sometimes people will say to me, well, I'm just monetizing my caseload, but I would argue there's so much more. And whether it's HVACs, like what your husband does, or just think of any other industry, you have materials, you have supplies, not as much as manufacturing or as HVAC companies, which is why working in such an intangible field, one of the challenges that clinicians have is quantifying, which is the third question of selling the business. How much is it worth? And what is a reasonable, fair value for the practice?
Mhm.
So there are ways to quantify methodologies. I don't know if we have the time for it today, but we can certainly do another episode on it. I've done a couple episodes on my podcast called SLP Money, talking about business valuation, metrics, things to look at. So if your listeners want to check that out, they certainly can, but I'm happy to come back and talk in more detail about it. But what's so important is it's, yes, some might consider it unethical, but I would tell you that they're not buying your clients, because depending on your population or whom you serve, certain people will age out, or you need this reoccurring revenue sources. So is it the relationship with the insurance company? Is it the relationship with the hospital system in town?
Mhm.
Is it through the contracts that you get? Is it the 30 employees that you have? Maybe you have a large clinic and you're looking to continue on in the community. I have one client who took 20% less than the valuation of her practice just to keep her name on the wall, because her sense of community and wanting to make sure everything stayed the same. She sold to a large, well-known, without saying names, well-known industry, large conglomerate that you and all of your listeners know, but I won't say the name. But they kept her brand, and that was really important to her. And she kept all her
Mm.
employees. And so as you go through the deal, it's called the deal making process. Just like when you sell a house, there's back and forth and things that are negotiated and terms and how to figure all that out. So all of that's important. But the major takeaway is that I, again, would argue every business can be sold, and I would argue should be sold, because you've put in the blood, sweat, and tears over the years or decades. And there are things to monetize, like that experience and those relationships and all of that. And I would argue that the sooner you get started, the better with that process, just because I told you about a 12-year buyout plan. There's others that are 3 years, but sometimes the hardest part is finding that other buyer,
Mhm.
because you don't necessarily always want to put it into the world that, hi, Danny's selling her private practice tomorrow, right? You
Yeah.
might spook your clients, you might spook your employees. So there is a methodology and a way to do it tactfully, and I would say correctly, with an order of operations, just like anything we've talked about so far today.
That is just, it just absolutely blows my mind. And I think we get, as SLPs, I think a lot of us get therapy so personal. It really is. And especially if you're the one that started, if you started your private practice, like most private practitioners, even, they may have a big clinic now, but they probably started with just them, like just them in their car or them in a one-room office. So I think like, and you have relationships with these clients, or your therapists have relationships with these clients. And so I think sometimes it's hard for us to disconnect for a second, and not out of greed, but just out of like recognizing that, yes, like the feel goods in the therapy room and helping kids, it's great. But first of all, you need to be turning a profit so that you can keep helping those kids, first of all. And then also that it's still a business and that you've built a business. So I'm so glad that you went over that. I do have one thing I want to touch on before I release you. We're just gonna have to do a part two. It's gonna happen. But before we press the record button, we were talking about retirement and really defining something that you said that you talk about a lot with your clients, is defining enough. So is that something, because we kind of touched on it earlier, like how much do you want for retirement? But can you go into that a little bit, especially with the very common questions that you get about retirement from SLPs, and like kind of what are those common questions that you get that you could kind of answer for us?
Totally. And so before, again, remember we have our 3 Ps in order. We always think of the plan first, implement the process to accomplish the plan, and then maybe we layer in products. So if we take your specific goal or objective of retirement, how do we put a plan together to think about retirement? How do we systematically save as part of a process for that? Systematically meaning, am I making monthly contributions, annual contributions, various throughout the year? And then the product. So there's certain specific type of accounts that you can save for retirement. Many people know of if you work at a school district or hospital system, you know the 403b, right? That's a product created to help specifically save for retirement. So before I get into the specifics, one of the common things that we see that's a problem is sometimes people are what we would argue very illiquid. Illiquid meaning they're saving all of their money into their school's 403b. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but you just have to know the rules of the game. And so the rules of the game meaning if you wanted to access that money at age before age 59 and a half, you have to pay a 10% penalty. You have to pay your ordinary income tax rate. So all of a sudden, if something happens at age 45 and I need money, I have to take $50,000 out of my 403b. Well, it's going to be a 10% penalty. That's $5,000. If I'm in the 20% tax bracket, that's another $9,000. So all of a sudden, my $50,000 has whittled down to $34,000. Again, it doesn't mean 403bs or retirement accounts are bad, but they are created specifically for the goal of retirement savings. And too many times we see people who, if they don't have liquidity on their balance sheet, personal or business, because things happen in life to everyone and we all need access to money. And why I brought up the credit card interest before is if all the money is saved in retirement and you don't want to pay tax and penalty, maybe you run up the credit card bill and then you're just paying large amounts of interest. So don't underestimate the importance of liquidity, not just because if bad things happen, but it also might be good things like wanting to grow your private practice or buy an investment property or do other things with it. So I'll go more specific into the retirement planning, but I always like to lead out with that. Just a statistic for you, and this is a slide that I usually share in presentations when I talk about retirement planning. One of the reasons why you, Danny, and your listeners might not know about that 10% penalty or the tax implications or other fees associated with retirement plans is that for every $1 that gets spent on financial education, there's another $25 spent on financial marketing. So think about maybe the television show you watch or the magazine article you read. Sometimes you see follow the green line, the orange squirrel, the numbers that people carry around, right? All these different commercials and things that you see over time, because what's really important when you're dealing with any product, professional services firm or organization or person is you should always know how people are compensated. And two, you should know the rules associated with how they're paid and how they're compensated. So for instance, the federal government loves when you put your money into these types of accounts because yes, it defers taxes, but going with part two of the statistic, in 2020, there was 5.7 billion with a B, $5.7 billion paid in early withdrawal fees from 401ks and IRAs.
Wow.
So where do you think that $5.7 billion goes? To the government. So it helps offset other taxes and other things, but just by not knowing the rules of the game, just unnecessary fees or penalties that are paid. So knowing how people are compensated, knowing the financial incentives of different institutions or different organizations is really important. Again, there's no judgment for me, pros, cons, whatever, but you should never, we talked about emotion, and sometimes not just in my industry, any industry, sometimes you just don't vibe or you don't gel with a professional. And sometimes they might make you feel inferior or foolish for asking a very rudimentary question, right? Like you might say to me, Craig, I want to open a retirement account. Or you might say, what's an IRA? And somebody might say to you, well, how do you not know what that is? Why aren't you saving for that already? You should have already had $100,000 in that. Well, shouldn't really cast judgment, but that's just my opinion. But that was a bit of a tangent, but if you want me to go more specifically on retirement accounts, I can now.
Well, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the liquidity thing. Cause first of all, if you could just briefly explain what the liquidity is. And second, could you explain what that, like an example of what liquidity would look like?
I try to avoid, thank you so much. I try and avoid financial jargon as much as I can, because like I said, when people speak and use, even when I hear doctors, right? We all go see doctors, and when doctors say very technical, specific terms, like, what are you talking about? Like, why am I here? I feel sick. Like, how do I feel better?
Fix me.
Yeah, exactly. I don't need to know about the specific terms and technicalities. What liquidity means is having access to capital or cash, which is really important both in your personal life or as a business owner. So liquidity could mean having access to credit, but not necessarily using it. So I would encourage all of your listeners to think about just activating something called a Heloc, home equity line of credit. It works just like a checking account, but in a case of emergency, you can write a check off of the equity in your home. So for instance, if my house is worth $500,000 and I have a $300,000 mortgage, that means I have equity of about $200,000. I can go to my local credit union and say, hi, I'd like to open a Heloc, and they'll give you a checkbook and they'll say, we'll give you access to $100,000 of equity in your home. It works like a credit line, depending on the interest rate. Maybe it's 3, 4, 5%. But if you need a roof repair or if you need anything in your life, you can access it. So just access to capital. The most common example would be what's called an emergency fund. And I know you've talked about this in your social media and your courses. So an emergency fund would just be saving for a rainy day. But that doesn't mean that you have to leave it in the bank and you have to leave it earning 0%, right? There's other investments, there's other opportunities, there's other ways to let the money work for you. But having cash or access to cash is really important. So that's what liquidity means, just access to capital or cash. It could be a liquid checking or savings account. It could be a home equity line of credit. But what the opposite would be being illiquid, or another way of saying that might be like house poor, is if I buy a really expensive house and all my money is tied up in my house. Like a house is an asset. It's worth an amount of money. It's positive on your balance sheet. But if I need $100,000 and the bank will only give me a $50,000 HELOC, where am I going to get this other $50,000 from? Mm-hmm. So access to cash, access to capital, really important, especially as a business owner, because you might go through a cash crunch. You might need to meet payroll. You might need to do anything within the business, and having access to cash and not having to run up really expensive credit card debt is just a general best practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of private practitioners get overwhelmed with like, oh, because so always like to, I love how you said you don't like to use, you try not to use too many fancy like finance terms. And I'm glad you said that, because a lot of times in my stories or like on, other podcast episodes, I kind of like poke fun at all the fancy terms, because like I feel like we hear those things, and a lot of us as SLPs, we don't like to admit that we don't know something. Like, I don't know if you knew that, but we don't like to admit that we don't know all the time.
Well, that just goes into the stigma of what you're talking about, right? And like, you might feel like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, guy, and what the hell is he talking about? I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yes, like, are you like, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. So I totally understand, and that's why I appreciate you asking about the liquidity question, because sometimes some phrases are just common to me, and I'm happy you brought that up, because another just general belief of mine when I work with clients is I should be able to explain it to a 5-year-old and just literally write it out in a purple crayon on one piece of paper. And if it's more complicated than that, I almost say sometimes buyer beware, because maybe doesn't have to be so much complexity to this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of components of financial planning, right? Whether we're talking about investing, risk management, like different types of insurance, homeowners insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, whether we're talking about tax planning, estate planning, there's all these pieces of the pie. But again, they could all be explained pretty simply. And if it needs to get more complicated, that is certainly a time to layer in a professional. Like part of financial planning is estate planning, but I'm certainly not an estate planning attorney, so I won't draft estate planning documents for you. But if you shared a goal of, I want to accomplish this upon my passing, or I want this to happen with my assets, well, yeah, we can strategize a plan, but then you go to the estate attorney who he or she puts it together for you and puts the documents and all of that together.
And I think sometimes, and I have to remind people of this a lot, is like, I think we automatically go to that stuff, like the complicated stuff, like annuities and like, it's like, okay, hold on. Like, you don't even know what an IRA is yet. Like, let's hold up a second.
It's funny you say the annuities, because I got asked about annuities at the most recent conference I spoke at, and I just said to her, I said, well, why are you asking me about annuities? Why do you think it's good? And she's like, I don't know. I was like, well, where'd you even hear that word? Because it's a very specific financial product. Like, where did that come from?
And a lot of times we're just like, we think we're supposed to know it, but a lot of times no one taught us. Like, a great example, like I have a whole chapter in the ebook that we just put out on health insurance, and just like the basic, like most people, like when I kind of asked around, like for things that when I was creating the book, I was like, do you know what an HMO versus a PPO plan is? And like, nobody knows.
And then now there's an EPO now too. So that makes it even more confusing.
Yes. And it's like, it's all of these things that, I'm really glad that so obviously I give everyone permission, but I'm an SLP. I'm glad that someone like you're specializing in this field, like giving people permission to not know, and that is okay. Like that's okay.
Well, and that it's just right, and it's just learning to delegate. I mean, it goes back to what we talked about with delegation earlier. Sometimes people think they want to do everything or do everything on their own, um, and so sometimes it's just a challenge. But it's funny, annuity. I was going to bring up a couple more visuals for you to tie in back to the retirement conversation, because remember, plan, process, product. And so this is, again, equations. I know this is part of my presentation that I gave at ASHA back in November, but knowing your numbers, and this is an equation we use to define retirement income. Because right now, if you're working, you're used to just getting a paycheck.
Yeah.
When you retire someday, you need to still earn an income, and there are various assets or various streams that can occur to help replicate your income. And you asked earlier, how do I determine that? How do you know that? That's up to every individual. And like I said, some people want to live on $5,000 a month. Others want to live on $25,000 a month. I can't answer that for you. I can look through your budgeting, and your course on budgeting is such a wonderful thing and such a wonderful exercise. But at the same time, every individual is different. This gets into the nitty gritty of actually trying to calculate how to replicate or reproduce, let's just say $10,000 a month of income. And so if you're listening on the podcast, there's 3 categories we break down into the retirement income part. You have guaranteed income sources, you have variable income sources, and you have other income sources. And on this visual, there's just a bunch of other subcategories. Danny, I'll send you the link. I wrote a pretty lengthy long form article just about saving for retirement as an SLP. And this gets into the really specifics of these different components of this equation. But when we go back to guaranteed income, one area that a lot of people either overlook or don't necessarily appreciate is Social Security income. Depending on how you're taxed, especially as either as an entity or as an employee, you're paying into the Social Security system right now. And so knowing that will be a piece for you down the road is important to consider. You mentioned annuity. You can see annuity on the screen. That's just a product that guarantees income. What an annuity is you write a check to an insurance company and they give you an income stream for life. So you write me a check for $100,000 and I will pay you $5,000 a year as long as you live. Right? If you work in the school district or hospital, maybe you have a pension, and they'll give you a lot of different pension options, and trying to figure out what the optimal pension option is for you. But that's all important to figure out what is guaranteed income for you, because sometimes people think they're used to getting a paycheck for $10,000, but all of a sudden between Social Security income, maybe you have a small pension, maybe that's $4,000 of your $10,000 right there. Right? So you might get closer to that retirement income level. Next comes the variable income phase, which we break into 3 categories. You have what's called a qualified account, which is a fancy jargony way of saying a retirement account. Qualified means that the money goes in pre-tax in the current year. So if I have $100,000 of income and I put $10,000 into my employer's 401k, my taxable income for the current year is $90,000. So it's a really good way to save in a current year tax savings, and it'll also allow your money to grow tax-free and tax deferred. So again, the 401k is a specific type of retirement product. And then if you're self-employed, you can save into other products like a SEP IRA, a solo 401k. You can layer in additional things called profit sharing plans. So again, it all just comes back to how much you want to save for retirement. The maximum in 2022 to save into a solo 401k, solo meaning you're self-employed but want to have a 401k with what's called a profit sharing program, you can save up to $61,000 into that this year if you want. So again, if my business made $100,000 this year and I wanted to make a maximum solo 401k and profit sharing plan contribution to that plan, I put in the $61,000, and then my taxable earnings is only $39,000 for the current year. So I'm stashing a lot of cash for the specific goal of retirement, and I'm also paying significantly less in tax in the current year, because instead of being taxed at $100,000, I'm only being taxed at $39,000. So in addition to the qualified, you have the opposite, which is called non-qualified, and this is another way that people can save for retirement, but also to help accomplish other financial goals. There are types of accounts called brokerage accounts, and that allows you to invest in bonds, stocks, the stock market, other types of assets. You don't get the current year tax savings, but it's another way to invest and help earn interest or rates of return to grow your money. And then the third bucket, which is super important, which we've touched on, is your private practice if you're a business owner. Because certain people, this is a question that I like to ask people is if you were, and I can ask you, Danni, if you put money into your 401k, what average rate of return would you expect over the life of the investment in your 401k?
Average rate of return, it's 7 to 8% on the market. I like to go 7%.
Perfect.
To be conservative.
Perfect. Right. Over a long-term investment horizon, I would agree. I would argue anywhere from 7 to 10% on average, right? For if my 401k is going to be invested for 10, 20, 30 years, that's certainly reasonable. Now, if you put it, let me ask you another question. If you put $1 into your private practice, what do you expect to earn on that dollar?
Oh, I guess like specific. Yeah, I haven't really thought about that. Like when I buy things, like I think about, I know it's going to give me a return, but yeah, I haven't thought of it in a percentage that way.
Awesome.
Me think.
So that's one of the key things that we will help you do as a private practice owner, because every dollar you put into your business should be considered an investment, not just expenses like payroll, but am I buying a new scope? Am I doing new marketing activities? Am I hiring? So here's a perfect example for those who are listening, who might be afraid to make your first hire and bring on your first contractor. You might be thinking, well, it's going to cost me $50,000 plus of salary, plus another $10,000 of benefits, health insurance, et cetera. So it's going to cost me $60,000 to hire someone. But over the lifetime of that employee, what will that do to A, the valuation of your practice in the long run, and B, what will it do to your current year income and allow you to either free up time or see more caseload and more clients? So there are methodologies to try and calculate what the internal rate of return is when you invest into your practice. And I would argue that the main reason why I've gravitated towards working with business owners, again, I work with SLPs in all lines of profession, right? You might be an employee, you might work in a hospital system, but the super exciting thing for me are the private practice owners, because figuring out, wow, I put $1 into my business and it gave me 12 to 15%. Like, you just told me you'd be happy with 7 in the stock market.
Yeah.
You get 12 to 15. You can almost double it in your business. Now, that doesn't mean you'll immediately receive it. And it might not be, this is the difference between liquid and illiquid, right? So your private practice is a very illiquid asset, just similar to your house. It's hard to sell. It takes a long time. But at the end of your career, when you are ready to sell, all of a sudden you have this asset. The story I shared earlier, $650,000. Many clinicians have 7-figure businesses. At some point, that is going to be a tremendous asset. I would argue either number 1 or number 2 on most people's balance sheets. Number 1 is either the home or the business, and number 2 is usually whatever's not number 1. So it's really important to think and not be so timid. And it all comes back to just the individual clinicians and not knowing what you don't know. $1, right? The king or queen of everything is cash flow. What are you doing with your money and where is it going? And so even if it's earmarked for retirement, is it always best to put it into the 401k and the profit sharing plan, or is it worth it to reinvest into my business?
Yeah. And
anecdote, I can't answer that today, of course.
Right.
But my point is these hypothetical questions of what is my money doing for me, and what are all these different goals I'm trying to accomplish?
And it's even back to what you're like the goal thing that you were saying. So one thing that I've mentioned to people before is, and you kind of touched on it earlier, was this idea, you're not able to access that money in retirement accounts until you're 59 and a half or whatever. Now there's ways, like for the Roth IRA, you access the principal. For now, we still have the back door. For now we can do the Roth conversion ladder. I'm hoping that doesn't go away.
Write your congressman or woman.
Yes, yeah. If you guys want to know, that is, I'm going to do an episode on what the Roth conversion ladder is at some point. But essentially, there's ways to access that money before you become retirement age. But either way, you still need to plan for those things. Like if you just wait to the last minute, you're going to pay your tax rate and your penalty. But I think it's really important to know, like me wanting to retire or become work optional. And I like that phrase, work optional, because I don't think I'll ever completely totally stop working. Like I enjoy working, but you never know. But like,
well, so let me go back. sorry to cut you off, but let me go back to just this slide real quick. And that's the third category. We've talked about guaranteed income, variable income, and then there's other income. So again,
Ah,
making work optional. Let's say you have $10,000 of income from your guaranteed income sources, your variable income sources, and you want to keep working. Nobody says I meet a lot of retirees who find retirement to be quite boring, to be honest.
mhm.
It's hard to go, especially when you're working 40, 50 hours. You might not want to work 50, you might want to work 20. And you
Yeah.
might want to work 2 days in the clinic, not 5. And if that's the case, then all of a sudden your retirement income gets another 2 to 3,000 a month because of your part-time income or your
Mhm.
rental income, or maybe you want to be a professor at a university. Um, and if you are a business owner, you don't have to sell 100% of your business. You could always be what's called a passive owner. You could retain 20%, 30% of the business in perpetuity. So it's like a dividend or rental income, additional income over time. So I guess to try and make this, wrap this part up of the conversation, it really just all revolves around knowing these different assets and different pools, and just, this is where you get into the really nitty gritty and the details. But again, just at a broad based, how much am I spending, the budgeting, what do I need to reproduce my current income? Because if I can do that, in theory, you could retire tomorrow.
Yeah. Retirement's not an age, it's a number. Like that's why, and I think even the fire community has started. So I've talked about fire on here before. It's financial independence, retire early. And there's like a whole fire movement. Some people are like super extreme, like, they live in a storage container and they don't own a car. But there's all different levels of it. But a lot of the people in the fire community are saying, instead of the R's being retire early, it would be financial independence, relax early, because it's this idea of retirement doesn't necessarily need to look like you not working anymore. And I think that, and honestly, that's like my personal goal for SLPs is, if we're not so dependent if we're not living paycheck to paycheck anymore, if we're not so dependent on that employer that is not treating us well, is not letting us do the therapy we need to do and do right by our kids, that we have that option to start our business or just do what we want. Because for me, like, I think that's going to revolutionize the field. Like, because when you've got a solid financial foundation, if you've got a retirement, like if you know what you're going towards in the future, it makes it a lot easier to leave those toxic work situations, to start your own business. A lot of the things, I mean, you mentioned burnout, a lot of the things that are serious issues in our field right now, I think would be completely changed if SLPs had their financial house like in order and really knew where they were going. That way they weren't so dependent on a job that sucks and like is not treating them right, because that happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's why if you can be reliant on yourself, and that's one of the benefits of being the business owner too, right? Nobody will ever care more about you than you do yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so again, I think, like I said, there's so many routes to go. I don't know if your listeners will give you feedback after we wrap up, but if there are specific questions or more questions, I'm always happy to hop back on one of these calls with you. I would just conclude, we didn't really touch on this part. We did a little with the health insurance conversation, but there's so many individual insurances that everyone needs, and evaluating what's the appropriate amount. Do I need this? If I need it, how much do I need? What's the right appropriate type? Should I have certain levels of coverage? Even I know one of the common things SLPs complain about are just the ASHA dues. What do I get for being an ASHA member? It's not here to say ASHA is good, bad, and different, but I know most SLPs are members of ASHA. I wrote another article about what is ASHA and what is the benefits of being a member in ASHA. Most people take advantage of the pro liability insurance offered in partnership with Mercer. But there's some other things on there. So a good website, I don't know if you've ever been to it, the SLH Advisor website. There's a lot of different insurances on that website so that they offer. So pro liability is the most common one. I know a lot of people take advantage of that discount, but thinking about ways to offset costs, that's the definition of insurance, right? Trading risk and things that you can't manage either on your personal balance sheet or your business balance sheet to an insurance company. And so sometimes sometimes financial risks are too great to keep on our own balance sheet. I would argue that's why most people have homeowners insurance, right?
Yeah.
If a hurricane happened and destroyed my house, and I live in South Florida, and I didn't have a hurricane insurance, I don't know if I have the money. I certainly don't have the money to rebuild and just go into the bank and rebuild a house.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I did, is that the most economical way to do it?
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
rather pay the homeowner's insurance every year, and if something happens, then have them rebuild the house.
And I think that goes into like that understanding, looking at things from a business mindset versus a consumer mindset. Most of us have just acted as consumers. Like insurance is a cost, which it is a cost. It's an expense. Like it's just something I have to pay for. This is something I have to pay for. But reframing things, like even and you can, and I love like all the fancy financial terms. What is it? Redistributing risk. Is that what you said? What was it?
Transference of risk.
Transferring risk.
That's
I love
that's
that.
that's the certified financial planner definition of insurance. Just the
Yes.
transfer from your balance sheet to another balance sheet. And so sometimes I have to get a little jargony, but that's as basic I think as I can bring it. And so, I mean, just the other example is, the one that I think is most overlooked by most SLPs, especially that have certifications and specializations, is disability insurance. And the main reason for that is because, let me ask you, we've been talking about how to replicate retirement income, save, grow. If you couldn't go to work tomorrow, what would happen to your financial balance sheet?
We have long-term disabilities, but it
Good.
doesn't kick in for like 3 months. But yeah,
But
like that would be
three,
devastating.
3 months. I mean,
Yeah.
that's fine. I would argue that's probably the most efficient way to do it, just because there is a balance between premium costs and benefits received. But if you're a 30-year-old SLP listening and
Mhm.
you're going to work for the next, let's just say 25 years, you're going to retire at 55 or make work optional. If you're going to earn $50,000 over the next 25 years with some cost of living adjustments in there, you're going to earn anywhere between $3 to $4 million over the course of your career. And now, if you save none of that money and you spend it all, then you'll have spent $3 to $4 million. But if for some reason you couldn't show up to the clinic and work, how
Mhm.
are you going to reproduce or replicate that $3 to $4 million of earned income that you would have received?
Right, right.
So
And
that's what
that,
that's what disability insurance does. And so
yeah.
oftentimes clinicians don't have it, or they rely on their employer and they think they have it, or they think they have it and they don't read the fine print. They don't know what they have. So that's another thing that I think is often overlooked, but extremely important, just to the foundation of a financial plan.
Yes, yes, that's something that I haven't talked too much on the podcast. You're like giving me all these ideas for things I need to make episodes about.
Well, so I was going to say that on my podcast, the SLP Money Podcast, I have a whole episode, I think, just about disability insurance. So it may not be the best listen for 30 minutes, but for anyone that really wants to nerd out and learn everything about it and the fine details, then you can certainly do that.
And what we're going to do, so I know that Craig has referenced a lot of different his podcast, his website, and a couple PDFs. All of that is going to be in the show notes. So you're going to have access to all of that. So that if you want to look at that at a later date. And we're going to do a part 2, guys. So if you're listening to this, send me a DM on Instagram with any other specific topics that you want for us to cover, because Craig, you're just like a huge, ginormous wealth of knowledge. And I think it's a lot of things that I think people have a lot of anxiety about, but just don't know where to look to get the specific nitty-gritty information. And I think people don't realize, like, there are professionals that, like, this is their thing. Like how we teach kids how to talk and eat, like that's like our thing. Like this is your thing.
It's exactly right. And that's why I would, you know what you know. I know we've said that a couple of times today, but most people, you stay in your lane. You are expertise in certain areas, and that's why you're a highly earning, successful professional in your field. But there's so many other things in life that we need help with or access to. I would also say that sometimes when we talked about the psychology of money earlier and just the emotion attached, it's so interesting because if I give a lecture or a webinar, most people are, I ask for feedback or questions, things like that. One hand goes up, maybe. There's always that one person who doesn't care and they'll just ask anything. But then I give my email, or I give other communication ways to be in touch with us, and I get flooded with emails with just individual questions. And that, I think, is part of the emotional or the stigma attached to it. Is there's such a taboo talking about money and earnings and income and all of that, that many people are afraid to just bring it up in public or share, you know what, I earned $70,000 a year. They don't want to be judged and say, well, I earn 100,000. So, joke's on you. So I think a lot of people are afraid to come out with their questions. And so I'm happy that you're going to receive those. If you want to forward them on to me, I'm happy to collaborate either on a part 2 or some other method to anonymously answer or answer the anonymous questions.
Yes, I would love that. So y'all heard it, and we'll include all of Craig's information in the show notes. Before I finally let you go and release you into the wild, what's any final words that you like, if people remember one thing from today's episode, what do you want them to remember?
Can I answer that with a part A and a part B?
Yes.
So part A, if you are a private practitioner or a clinician, please remember the story I shared earlier that your business is worth something. You should sell it prior to leaving the business or just shutting your doors and selling it for nothing. Every business is worth something. So coordinating that with collaboration and partnership and building relationships in your city, your county, your state, your specific niche. If you have a specific niche, there's plenty of collaboration that goes on. So please make sure that you retain that. And then number two, for everyone, because if you're not a private practitioner, that may not be important to you, is just know, and if you feel that you're not saving, you may feel like you're saving enough. You may feel like you're not saving enough. But one activity that we do with every client is especially when they onboard and start working with us, is we go over 3 months of all statements. So credit card statements, this is probably covered in your budgeting course, but you can think about it as budgeting. But the biggest thing is knowing where your cash flow is going and always putting a line item on your expenses to pay yourself first. So for various savings, for various liquidity accounts that we talked about, to make sure that you do that for yourself. And so I can't tell you how many times people are so surprised at they're spending X dollars on a certain thing, dining out, car payments, anything, Amazon, right? Amazon now people, that's like usually the largest line item on people's credit card statement because everybody gets things on Amazon or from any internet provider, right? So just knowing what you're spending and then just knowing compound interest, and that if I was to able to save an extra $100 a month for the next 30 years and earn that 7 to 10% on that money, you're talking about $200,000-$400,000 just because you slimmed back. So don't try and make huge cuts. Just go through and start with one thing and then another and then another. And I would encourage everyone to try and do that.
Excellent. I love it. Thank you so much. We're gonna work in a part 2 because this was just too good. This was just too awesome. But thank you so much for being on the show and hanging out with us today. Guys, remember Craig did show us some visuals on the screen. So if you're listening to this on audio, you can also go check it out on YouTube so you can actually see the video, so you can kind of see all the visuals that he used. But thank you so much for being here today, and I hope you have a great weekend.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Danny. Take care.
Yes. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to hear more no fluff, getting the dang thing done stuff from myself and other real life SLPs, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or pledge a small amount on Patreon.